Hello and welcome to a lovely sunny morning in Cambridge. The temperature now is well into the 20s, which is such a relief after months of dull, cold weather and the orchids sitting there thinking it would be nice if it was spring. But now everything's beginning to grow and there's lots of things going on and of interest. My pride and joy at the moment is this orchid, Angraecum vigueri. I bought this about 8 years ago, and after a couple of years it was about that tall and produced one flower. I planted it in a teak sort of box that I made for it, and it developed really quite well. It's nice when an orchid that you buy really enjoys the conditions that you've got and thrives, and I think this one has. Sadly, that's not always the case. Anyway, this one has done really well, and since it produced its first flower, it's got better and better each year. It's a magnificent species of Angraecum, I must say. And for me, at least, although it's supposed to be scented at night, which it is, it has that lovely gardenia scent that is typical of Angraecums. This one, at least in my conditions, smells in the day as well. Really lovely. Last year, I became a little bit concerned because the box that it was originally in and the bark that I planted in had become really quite mushy and lost all its structure. And all the live roots were on the outside and nothing living on the inside. But I was really concerned because the word is that if you disturb an Angraecum roots, it really doesn't like it, so I was quite nervous. Anyway, I thought something needed to be done, so I carefully extracted as much of the old bark as possible from inside and thoroughly washed it out. I couldn't remove the roots from the original basket that I made, so I made a new basket for it to go in, just to sit it inside, so that the new roots could develop on the outside. And so far, it looks as if I've succeeded. And this year, it has produced more flowers than ever. So this is if you do get the chance to grow this, it's a really wonderful orchid. Whilst I'm here, I'll also show you this other Angraecum. This is Angraecum germinyanum. Has these beautiful pure white flowers. I saw a huge specimen that must have been several times this size grown by I once saw a huge specimen grown by Kew Gardens exhibited at an orchid show in London a few years ago. It must have been 4 times the size of this and had probably a dozen flowers on it. So I was quite inspired by that and planted it on you can see it's on a cork, or quite hard cork mount, but nearly all the roots are on the outside. And this has done exceptionally well. The huge advantage of it is that it produces at least one flower almost through the year. They produce flowers successively along the branches. And as over the years it's developed side branches, it's become better and better. The downside for me is, because I'm so interested in orchid scents, is that at no time have I ever been able to smell anything with this particular species. However, it's very elegant. It obviously has this lovely sort of cascading habit, and as the side branches grow, at first they start going up and then they gradually hang down, so that it produces, I think, a really elegant display. And it hangs up here, and there's almost always a flower to look at, which is lovely. Whilst on the subject of Angraecums, this is the famous Angraecumsesquipedali, made famous by Darwin's thesis that it must be pollinated by a moth that had an incredibly long proboscis to reach to the depth of the tube with the nectar at the bottom. What I wanted to say about this was that in contrast to my other two Angraecums, this one has had a very checkered history for me. I bought it as a sort of 2-year out of flask plant, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, perhaps slightly more. And as you can see, there were actually 2 plants growing side by side. I didn't separate them. I thought I'd leave them. And it grew, both of them grew well for a number of years. No flowers, because they hadn't reached that size. Planted in a cedar box that I made. Now the problem was that 3 or 4 years ago, we had a really hot summer. And so I thought it would be a good idea to give it a good soak. Well, I gave it a good soak. But then after a month or so, one of the leaves started to look a little bit miserable, you know, as they do when you can see that something's going wrong. And although this plant was the larger of the 2 and had grown really well, eventually I lost the entire top of the plant right back to the base. You can just see here that the original plant is here. Anyway, luckily, it produced a shoot from below the point where it had died, and that's saved the plant. Since then, the plant that was the small of the 2 has grown up, and this is the first year it has flowered. Meanwhile, the small one is now beginning to catch up. 2 interesting things about this particular one. You'll see that as Angraecumsesquipedales go, this isn't very large. And this is a clone that is given the name Sandridge. Now, Sandridge is a part of Hertfordshire where the famous Sanders orchid nursery used to be, and another nursery, which has sadly since gone out of business, Ivan's Orchids, took over, I think, some of the land and some of the orchids. And I think this clone must date back to Sanders Orchids, and it's much smaller, which for me is good because I haven't got as much room as a typical Angraecum would take up. Now, the latest mishap with this is that it should have had 2 flower spikes, but one of them, I must have, I don't know, got some water on it. It's very easy to do in the winter when it was developing, and I lost that one. And this flower, strangely, I've never had it before, but the tube has somehow, well, the flower hasn't developed properly, and the tube is absent. There's a bit of sort of distortion around the base of the flower here, so I think that's the remnants of what should have been the tube. Anyway, I'm hoping, having learnt quite a lot of valuable lessons with this orchid, that from now on, by being extremely careful with what I do with the water that might get in the leaf axils, I might finally have cracked it, and maybe in a few years I'll have 2 really nice plants with more flowers. Let's hope so.